All right, so today we'll be talking about project sizing from the perspective of techniques, tools, and overall understanding of what it is and how to deal with it. Generally, sizing is not a common project management term. It's more of a sales term or informal term in a project management office. More commonly, it's referred to within project management community and standards as tailoring. Basically, tailoring is required for any project. It's not really something that is done specifically when you have preset templates for the projects or something like that. It's every time you start a project, you do tailoring of the processes, of the requirements, of the outcomes, how you approach this project, what kind of governance you apply to this project. So generally, you start with development approach, you analyze processes that apply to this particular project, you look at the project lifecycle from the perspective of upcoming project, and decide on stakeholders and deliverables. This is basically done during the initiation stage of the project and partially on the planning stage of the project. So to be more precise around what aspects can and should be tailored, let's talk about life cycle. Just a second. So life cycle is basically how you start the project, how it proceeds, and how you finish it. Since the project requires both initial stage, the actual execution, and the closure of the project to be precisely defined, or at least generally agreed on before project is started. So these are specifically project management terms, and that's the life cycle and development approach selection, the processes, engagement, tools, and overall methods and artifacts of the project. To be more specific around life cycle, essentially, you need to decide on the development and delivery approach for the project from the life cycle and development approach perspective. You can use things such as predictive approach. You can use iterative approach. Basically, you can use waterfall type of project methodology. You can use agile methodology. That depends really on a specific project. From the processes perspective, you need to determine which elements and portions of the existing processes apply to this particular project. So you can either decide on to remove particular parts of the life cycle of the project and development approach, or you can even modify or totally remove some parts if they don't apply to this particular project. And that's essentially the approach for general decisions on how to deal with the project. Engagement is essentially focus on stakeholders, but also on various methods how to work with these stakeholders. And that goes back a bit to the topic of the previous session around stakeholder management. So that's also important part of deciding on project tailoring. So first you identify stakeholders, decide what type of stakeholders are going to be there. And that basically helps you decide what kind of skills and capabilities are needed for these particular stakeholders, including project team, or including customers, including all the people who are known at the point of project tailoring. There is another term that's commonly used called empowerment. Empowerment basically is a selection of responsibilities and forms of decision making as deferred to the project team. Basically, how the project team is able to work with the project, with the processes, and with the stakeholders. And finally, around engagement, it's integration. How all the teams, all the stakeholders work together to make this project happen. So you need to, as a project manager, to decide what kind of engagement each type of stakeholder needs or can perform in scope of this project. Also, as I mentioned, tools is a big selection, but it's essentially tools that enable the teams to execute the project. Often it's some sort of project management tools and communication tools, such as Microsoft Project and other project management software and services. There can be additional tools, custom tools even for the company, depending on type of project management structure within the organization, as well as type of a project, such as cost analysis and risks analysis software. It's a possibility. For the methods and artifacts, again, depending on what type of life cycle and development approach is taken, it's necessary to then identify what kind of methods apply here. So it's fairly general in this aspect. So there are several so-called performance domains within project management methodology, and some of them are in particular impacted by the tailoring approach. So this development approach in life cycle, it's a performance domain, and you basically need to make sure that development approach is consistent with the desired project deliverables. Project life cycle consists of phases that connect to the execution of the project and delivery of the value, both for business goals and stakeholder values. And project lifecycle also needs to apply to the delivery cadence. Essentially, if you have a waterfall type project and you have just one-time delivery of artifacts, then the life cycle needs to be consistent with that. And planning performance domain is also heavily impacted by the tailoring process. Planning basically addresses everything from the project perspective deeply in terms of project plan development, documenting exact activities needed, documenting all the various plans for quality communication and other relevant plans. So all of this needs to be explicit and deliberate basically project manager shouldn't imply things. Project manager should write down everything that applies to the project delivery and the project structure from perspective of selected lifecycle and implementation approach. Also commonly used term holistic approach. Basically, project manager needs to know everything about the project and be aware of all the aspects and how they impact each other in order to deliver the best possible outcome. And as well as taking into account constant change and how it impacts delivery of the project. Because over time, there might be need to change development approach of the project. There might be need to change various elements and aspects of the project. From a time perspective, you shouldn't spend too little and you shouldn't spend too much. It has to be just the right time. Basically, planning the project as well as tailoring it from the perspective of various tools, processes, and people engaged. Therefore, it only comes with experience, really. It's very hard to learn how to spend the exact amount time needed for the sufficient, good enough plan. And all the information needs to be sufficiently captured and shared within the stakeholders network so that people have just enough information, not too much and not too little. This is also a touch and go approach. Basically, you cannot just decide this is enough information. It's more of an experience and collaboration effort in order to identify how much information is needed, what kind of information is needed. So this aspect is also important during tailoring and planning aspect. And overall plan adaptation during project execution is very important. Basically, it depends on the project, of course. Some projects never need to have a plan changed. Some projects need plan change, but in order to understand if there is such a need, you either define explicit waypoints where you do deliberate review of the project execution and project plan and make adjustments through change management, or you make decisions that no change is needed. So basically you need to have very deliberate approach to the change management. So the process of tailoring itself within all of this, it's pretty straightforward. Once you select initial development approach, you need to start tailoring for the organization that's impacted by this project. It can be inter-department, it can be cross-department, and might be some BU specific, not specific to the department. Or it can be even global, aimed at a certain customer, aimed at a certain industry or the organization itself. So this basically allows understanding of where this project applies. Then once the scope of the impact is identified, all the tailoring steps on this level are done, you move to the project level. You tailor all the aspects of the project for the project execution itself. And finally, you need to deliberately have regular review and implementation of changes to the project delivery. Since it's a living process, there might be a need to regularly change certain aspects of the project that's being executed. So going back to the sizing term, as I mentioned, it's more of a sales or informal term, but still commonly used. So often also referred to as T-shirt sizing, since sales departments, they like to use more visual terminology, but in reality, it's tailoring, project tailoring. So you have several criteria from the perspective of the project delivery and from the perspective of goals of the project. There are main criteria: the stakeholder impact, the risks, project risks, project responsibility level, and organizational level impacted. From stakeholder impact, you need to understand groups of the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by the project, by this change. And you need to be explicitly aware of impact and size it accordingly, such as once you identify the groups, you can explicitly state this group is not impacted at all, this group has low impact, this group has, let's say, medium impact, and this one is having a high impact from the project execution. Likewise, risks are a big factor, and from project management perspective, you start collecting project risks into risk register from the earliest date possible, basically even before project planning is started. And therefore, this helps. It's never possible to have the full register of all the risks, but at least knowing what you know at the time can help you understand the size of the project, essentially what kind of risks are impacting the project and how big of an effort you need to deal with these risks. Project responsibility level is essentially how important is this project, and it sort of overlaps with stakeholder impact, but also impacts how these stakeholders place themselves within the project, or if a project manager places them within the project. And finally, organizational level impacted, that's what I mentioned. How big is it, the impact? Is it just small internal project, or it's a project that impacts other business units, or it's a project that crosses the whole company or even the whole industry? This basically impact needs to be, first of all, identified and then specifically detailed. So this is going back to the project sizing terminology, and going back what it is. It's a process. It's a process of standardizing project planning, effort estimation, and resource planning. And often outcome, specifically for the sizing, not the tailoring overall, is to have a templated approach. So you will have document templates, processes templates, project parameter templates, such as budget, resources, deliverables, etc. And this helps with future projects, essentially. So project sizing is more of a effort that helps with future projects in most cases. But the idea stems again from project tailoring, which is done for every project in general. What are the additional criteria for project sizing? You need to understand how big of a project team you need for this project. That basically impacts resources, it impacts the budget, it impacts stakeholder management and communication management plans. You need to estimate project duration. I mean, not necessarily specific dates, but at least since every project has to have start and end date, you need to understand, is it a few days, is it a few months, years maybe. So that level of understanding helps in estimating project size. Time frame variation, also important. Is the schedule flexible for the project? Can schedule undergo variations, but with the very firm deadlines? So within deadlines, maybe schedule can be varied. Or maybe there is zero flexibility at all. Schedule is preset, you cannot deviate from it. Deadlines are fixed and cannot be changed. So this also is important. Now, the problem that's being solved, the change that is being implemented through this project, how complicated is it? Is the solution to get to this change, is it difficult to achieve? And these questions need to be answered. I mean, there can be extremely difficult solutions and extremely complicated changes, or it can be simple solution and a simple change as a result. So these differences need to be identified early on. And finally, are there any dependencies or related projects? It's always important to remember that you're not in sterile environment. You have a living environment that potentially other projects or other processes that are impacted by the project. This is also important to capture early on. It's somewhat overlapping with impact analysis in terms of departments, business units, and company and industry overall. Regarding project governance, again, project governance is more of a general understanding rather than a specific term, but basically it's a framework, functions, and processes, and essentially the approach that guide the activities within the project management in order to create this change that that this project strives to perform in accordance to the defined goals. And there are no specific tools that can be suggested, really. It's very specific to a company, to department even, or to the industry. So often these are more of a templated documents rather than specific tools. So first suggestion when doing tailoring for the project and doing project sizing are to reuse previously archived knowledge from previous projects. And often you can extract structure of the documentation to be applied to a certain new project if it's a matching sort of matching structure. So reusing prior knowledge is very much a good thing. It's just needs to be done with clear head, knowing that it's not a copy-paste process. It's a reusage of certain things that were done previously in the past. Very common tool is basically using spreadsheets like Excel, where you can have certain sizing options matched to certain value formulas, where you can define how many people you need, project team size, like what kind of budget you need, the costs of overall delivery. So this can be done through spreadsheets, especially if there are a lot of projects being executed. It makes sense to have something custom made on in a spreadsheet to have easier sizing for the project. And there's a link for people who have PMP membership. It's basically a template from one of the practicing project managers. So if you have membership, you can download it and view it. But essentially, it covers what we talked about just now. All right. Any questions? Any like practical requests or some problems that you had come in your life managing project from the perspective of sizing and tailoring needs to the projects?
I was thinking about the project, the approaches that you mentioned in the very beginning. So I usually, theoretically, I'm struggling to, I don't know the different approaches. So could you provide again examples of approaches to implement depending on the project?
Well, approach from general perspective, as I was mentioning, there can be, let's say, two types of approaches. One is waterfall type, where you start and finish, you basically plan in advance most of the project, and that's the waterfall approach. You define all the milestones, all the deliverables, all the goals early on in the project, and you stick to it. So you try to essentially plan everything in advance. That's the waterfall approach. And there is this agile approach, and agile means essentially you plan high-level goals, but you don't necessarily know every little aspect of every stage. So you plan in advance all the until next milestone in detail. You plan this part of the project. Once you reach milestone, you again iterate with the same goals, milestone planning and everything for the next milestone. And essentially until you receive final result, you go through these iterations. And there can be a hybrid approach where you have elements of waterfall and agile methodology. So that's what I meant from this kind of approaches to the project planning, and it heavily impacts tailoring of the project in the beginning.
Yeah, that now makes sense, because I know that agile, because you mentioned in one of the first sessions about these two types of the waterfall and the agile, but I was not sure. It's like a lot of information now. It makes sense to me. And about the sizing, in general, is it about sizing in terms of how many people and teams would be involved, or how many countries, or is it about the goal, how much of the system change would need, or what's the sizing criteria, I would say?
Well, let's go back to the criteria, the main criteria here. So it's a little bit of everything. In the end, you need to understand how much resources you will need, how big of a budget you need, what kind of tools do you need to engage, which impacts both resources and budget. and in the end, the costs for the cost center that will be paying for this overall project. So
And
it might be not explicit in some cases, like not all organizations have explicit cost being included into sizing criteria, but it is implied still because you use resources, you use budget, you use time. All of it is essentially money in the end.
So, but there is no leading criteria. So any of these can be the leading one. So for example,
yes.
Yeah. So if there are, let's say, 10 people will be involved, but it requires a major system change where the cost for the system and the development will be very high, we can consider it as a higher size of project, even though it's just a few people, or let's say up to 10 people involved or what.
Yeah, from this perspective, small size, medium size, large size project, it's indeed multiple factors that impact final size decision. In the end, small size projects, they might be like small team and even medium team, but with small impact or small budget in the end. You can apply sizing basically to decide what is the sizing, main sizing criteria. You can decide whether it's a budget, whether it's a cost of the project. Then if it's a cost, then you can just judge by the amount of money spent on this project. It can be a factor, main factor, deciding if it's a small, medium, or large project. It can be a level of impact, as you mentioned. Level of impact, meaning even smallest project with smallest budget can have a huge drastic effect across the whole company or industry. Again, it can be basically a large project, even though it's not very high budget project. So in the end, it's indeed a very personal decision, depending on conditions. Most often, it's in most common sense, it's the amount of money spent on this project. Basically, both budget and costs to the customer.
Right. When it's a very expensive project, then it's considered a high.
Yeah, it's a big project. I mean, it's the most common criteria, but not necessarily the one for the particular case. It's a matter of personal decision.
If there's no budget, like there is no bonus payments to the people that are full-time working for the organization, and there are no external experts involved. Like there is no higher cost for the company because the salaries they pay already are there is no increase or any kind of additional payouts.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, it still doesn't mean that there isn't any cost or budget being spent. There is, it's just a hidden implied budget. Even though there is salary being paid, these people are spending time on this project, and time is money within any business. So it's still a resource to this task. So from this perspective, you look at resources engaged. If there is no explicit budgeting and cost analysis, then you look from a resources point of view. In the end, everything is essentially money, how much money this project costs, from budget, from final cost to the customer, or from resource perspective, including impact and everything. So it's a sort of a
hard to estimate because you don't know, for example, it's kind of, even sometimes it's impossible to estimate. So for example, if there is a change in the onboarding process of new customers, you don't know first of all, how many new leads will come into the plate of each team, how much time they would spend. Okay, this you can measure if it's in average, some kind of timing for the process, then you can estimate how much it would take per lead to onboard. But then how many leads will come out, you don't know. You can see the statistics from previous times, probably something like that, if there is any, but it's also the time of the project manager and the time of the different leaders involved in creating the process, in maintenance activities.
Definitely. Quite often people forget that project manager is also a resource, and the time they spent is essential cost of this project. It's, you know, if there's, let's say, a project manager that handles 5-10 projects in a working day, it's one thing. But if it's a project that project manager has to spend full time, then it's completely different situation. So this is the criteria also for the project, how much resources are allocated. Maybe it's full-time resource for this project, meaning this big project. Again, it's a matter of decision from company culture and perspective. But as you mentioned, regarding doing statistical analysis, reviewing previous cases, that's sort of a going back to the archived information from previous projects, basically to understand what kind of cost would be for this new project, like how much time the people will spend, how much effort is needed, how big of a group of the people is needed in terms of resources. So that's also the important part, going back to the prior art, previous documentation, and making decisions based on comparison.
And is there any, you mentioned about this link with the templates, if you remember, but I'm still not a member actually, have to see. But in general, is there any template that we might use in order to estimate the hidden costs, like different points, like salary, I don't know, rate per hour for the operational teams, rate per hour for the, and then how many hours, and all that, like a spreadsheet or something that I could use?
Well, I haven't seen specific templates because it's also specific for each organization, but it's pretty straightforward. You have, let's say, units, how many people you have, like, let's say, engineer, salesperson, architect, project manager, whatever are the positions. There can be a multitude of positions, and you put value of hours spent, let's say, per week for this particular person. If it's a full-time engagement, you can put, let's say, 40 hours per week for a person and multiply by cost of an hour for the company. It doesn't have to be a cost of in terms of salary. It has to be cost in terms of how much company actually spends on, let's say, project manager per hour. It can be completely different criteria. That's at least how it was previously, in my experience. So it's pretty straightforward spreadsheet. You just multiply number of people by their cost and by hours they spent. Straightforward. There can be various custom formulas, but it's very, very specific to each organization and each project. So can't really tell that there would be some template that you can use out in the internet. So for the straightforward approach, just multiply human resources that are engaged, potentially includes resources like money spent on tooling that might be used. I don't know. Let's say if it's an example in IT, a data center launch, you need to include material costs. How much spent on renting, let's say, data center, purchasing equipment. Basically, you don't include just salaries, you don't include costs for the people, you include costs for everything spent on the project.
Yeah, infrastructure, any external services, anything like that.
Yeah. Even if it's like tool that's purchased specific for the project to use within the project, it's a cost that is incurred by this project.
Makes sense. Well, then it remains to do the big work.
Yeah, in the end, there isn't a magic bullet. It's always work for the project manager. But as I can tell that with experience, the more projects you execute, and if you document it and sort of templatize it, you can reuse this prior knowledge, prior experience to simplify execution of new projects. That helps really. And that includes having document structure, document details that you need to capture, potentially approaches for the project. Like, let's say if you commonly work with waterfall approach, then it makes sense to standardize this waterfall approach for the new projects, like milestones, deliverables, what kind of stakeholder groups are engaged. You'll just know that in advance and tailor it for the new projects with minimal effort in that case. Because the more project manager is efficient, the more efficient is the project in the end.
Makes sense. Yeah, honestly, I've never yet done a project sizing and budget in my documentation for the project. So, and I already have an experience with multiple projects. So I feel like I will create a one such sizing and budgeting for a project, and I will then reuse it for the next project so that I am more efficient, because it's, I don't have an estimation for the cost for my projects, which is, because they are internal and they do not require additional investments in terms of, external experts or salary increased bonuses, salaries or something. But as you said, the hidden costs are also costs.
Yeah. And even if you won't have any particular numbers on the term of how much a particular person costs, you still know how many people are engaged and how much time they spent on this project. So that's basically man hours is cost
the currency.
Cost criteria. Yeah, that's a currency essentially. And this is one way to evaluate project size by comparison with other projects. Basically, look at how much time and man hours are spent on a certain project. Even if you have no other visibility, you can still do sizing with it. And depending also on organization, this sizing requests can come from field teams, from sales teams. They would say, tell us how much it will cost for the customer. I mean, not necessarily that you're engaged right now with such projects, but it's a possibility. So then you will have criteria that you can quicker estimate at least area of the cost, how much this particular project would cost for the customer. Again, this only can be based on prior experience or similar projects, because you can't out of the blue just say that's how much effort I need. It never works. You need to base it on something.
Yeah. Okay. And then about the risk, is it meant the risk of not succeeding?
No. It's more of a risk management in terms of all kinds of risks. I mean, success is a big word, because project success means a lot of things. It can mean reaching some of the goals. It can mean reaching all of the goals. It can mean reaching time, budget, costs, resource use, multiple things. So you need to identify the risks, like losing timelines, like having to change timelines for the project. That's a risk. Like there's no certainty that these dates can be met. It's a risk, and it impacts project sizing, because in that case you need to add extra to make sure that you can continue with the project even if it moves past the current date. That's as an example. Or if it's a resourcing thing. I mean, sometimes project manager has no control over the resources allocated to the project. If let's say resources available on a certain period of time, you need to make sure that this is enough for the project. If not, you might have to double this resource, like let's say a person allocated to the project for the execution for the certain period of time, and then taken away for another project. You have to take into account, and this increases project size because you need to, let's say, double book the person. Those are the risks that I mean. It's impacting essentially success of the project, but from a different perspective of the success, meeting the timelines, meeting the budget, meeting the goals planned for the project, and meeting stakeholder expectations. So all of this.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I feel like it's more clear to me now.
Yeah, I'll send some of the links. I mean, there are available links that evaluate project sizes. They're not necessarily the most useful ones, but at least they provide perspective into what can be a hands-on criteria for project sizing. I mean, this presentation is more of a general overview, but specific ones, I'll share the links in the email.
Great.
Yep. All right. Did you have any ideas for the next topic?
I'm not sure if this could be a part of this training like series, but in general, I feel like in my organization, I need more of the agile approach. So could we have some time dedicated to the agile approach?
Yep, it definitely can be. I'll provide some overview of the agile approach and answer any questions.
Yeah, because it's very dynamic environment all the time. Something is changing. Also, it requires almost every requires some development activities, and to not waste time with the waterfall where we just expect the final result that will be achieved in 7 months or 9 months or something like that. That would work much better if we achieve some pieces.
As I mentioned, there can be also hybrid approach where you have waterfall project, but within this waterfall project, you have agile stages, let's say, like you reach certain milestone and you go to an agile format to implement certain software, let's say, or certain change. So yeah, it's definitely possible, and I'll stop on this.
The different approaches definitely are very useful if we cover them in more detail, because that's the basics of the project, I guess, the initial step to identify what kind of approach to use. Precisely,
and quite often, as I mentioned, it makes sense even during project execution. Makes sense to stop, take a look at the approach being applied, and maybe change it. So, yeah, it's also not desirable, but in the end, it might benefit the project.
Right, because everything changes. Also, sometimes those developers or whoever the people the project results depend on do not announce initially the risks or the difficulties that they might have, and eventually you understand that what they thought would be achieved in 1 month appears that cannot be even achieved in 6 months. So you have to change something.
That's by the way part of the risk management. So another topic could be risk management and planning for the unplanned, essentially, because you don't know what you don't know, and that's a risk. That's a risk right there, and you need to plan for this, and how to plan it, it's another entirely different skill. So we can also take a look at risk management.
That would be great.
Okay. All right. If no further questions, I'll stop the recording. Thank you.
Thank you.